It started like any other Saturday morning. Sunlight slipping through the curtains, the smell of toasted bread, the quiet hum of a house that had long stopped feeling like home. Thomas sat across from me, barely looking up from his phone. Every few seconds, his screen lit up with a message he'd pretend not to see. I poured him more coffee, pretending not to notice the distance stretching between us. It's strange how silence can scream louder than words. When he finally rushed out, saying he was meeting an old friend, I didn't question it. I'd learned that pressing for answers only built walls higher. I stayed behind, cleaning up the crumbs, humming an old tune just to fill the empty space he left behind. That's when I saw it. A manila envelope sitting at the edge of the table. Bold black letters stared back at me. Confidential. DNA test results. My hands froze midair, dish towel dangling like a white flag. For a moment, I told myself it had to be work-related. Thomas was in finance, always dealing with confidential things, right? But then my eyes caught something that made my stomach twist. His full name printed neatly on the back. Thomas Avery. My heart stumbled in my chest, a strange rhythm of denial and dread. I told myself not to look. But curiosity, it's a beast you can't unchain once it wakes up inside you. I sat down, the envelope still in my hand, feeling the paper's rough edge press against my skin. It was heavier than it should have been, or maybe it was just the weight of what I already knew, but didn't want to face. I stared at it for a long time, as if time itself might rewrite whatever truth it held. My breath was shallow, my pulse echoing in my ears. Then I whispered to the empty room, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just some mistake. Even lies sound gentler when you tell them to yourself. When I tore it open, the air in the room changed. Thick, electric, still. I pulled out the folded document, the kind printed in sterile fonts and cold numbers. Father, Thomas Avery. Probability, 99.98%. Child, Lucas Bennett. My eyes blurred before I even finished reading. Lucas. The same little boy Thomas had called Michael's kid. The one he'd taken to the zoo. The one he'd bought birthday gifts for. My throat tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I whispered his name, Lucas, like saying it out loud would make it less real. But the truth sat there, bold and merciless, staring back at me in black ink. He had lied, not just about the boy, but about who he really was. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, the world spinning off its axis. I sank into the chair, gripping the paper as if it could stop me from falling apart. Everything suddenly felt foreign. The room, the house, even my own heartbeat. The silence around me became unbearable. I could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock, each second like a needle in my chest. My hands shook as I folded the paper back into the envelope, trying to erase what I'd just seen. But some things, once known, can't be unseen. My eyes wandered to the chair where he'd sat that morning, laughing about something on his phone, acting as if our life was perfectly ordinary. It was almost cruel how normal the moment had felt before everything shattered. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to remember every small lie that had built up to this one. The late meetings, the business trips, the sudden kindness whenever guilt got too heavy for him to carry. I thought about the way he'd smile at me, patient, practiced, a man rehearsing love. My throat burned. Betrayal doesn't come with fireworks. It comes quietly, in moments like these, when you realize you've been loving a ghost. I wanted to scream, but instead I laughed, a hollow sound that startled even me. How strange that life could split in two between one heartbeat and the next. The woman who poured his coffee that morning wasn't the same one sitting there now. I looked at the envelope again, the proof of a truth I never asked for. Somewhere deep inside, a cold resolve began to form. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd never see him the same way again. By the time he came home that evening, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. I'd spent hours replaying every word he'd ever said, trying to decide whether I'd confront him or keep pretending. When I heard his key turn in the lock, my body stiffened, like muscle memory preparing for war. He walked in humming, the same easy tune he always used when he thought life was fine. I watched him from the living room, a stranger wearing my husband's face. He smiled, tossed his keys in the bowl, and called out, "Hey, Grace, smells good in here." I wanted to throw the DNA results at him, but instead, I just stood there, calm on the outside, chaos underneath. "How was your day with Michael?" I asked, keeping my voice light, casual, almost kind. He looked up, puzzled, blinking as if the question came from nowhere. "Michael?" he repeated. My pulse quickened. He wasn't ready for this conversation. "Your old friend," I said slowly. "The one with the little boy, Lucas." I could see his throat tighten, his smile falter just enough for the truth to slip through. "Yeah, good," he stammered. "He's managing." I nodded, watching every twitch in his face like a lie detector come to life. Then I laid the folded paper on the table, the one word that burned brighter than all the others. "Father." His eyes landed on the paper, and I watched the color drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. "Grace," he whispered, voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." That line, that tired, pathetic line, almost made me laugh. I'd heard it in movies, in stories of other women who thought betrayal was something that happened to other people. But now it was my story, unfolding in real time. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said softly. 99.98% Thomas. That's not a typo." He opened his mouth, searching for words that might soften the blow, but the truth had already burned through every excuse he could make. "I was going to tell you," he said, almost pleading. My jaw clenched. When? When he turned 18? I could see the panic in his eyes, not because he'd hurt me, but because he'd been caught. He took a step closer, his hand reaching for mine, but I stepped back, the distance between us finally matching the emotional miles he'd created. In that moment, something inside me went still. I looked at him, really looked, and realized I didn't even recognize the man standing in front of me. The familiar shape was there, same shoulders, same hands, same voice. But the essence of him, the man I thought I'd built a life with, was gone. I felt like a widow mourning someone still breathing. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You lied to me, Thomas. Not once. For years." And he had no words left to fight back. He sank into the nearest chair, elbows on his knees, rubbing his temples like a man defeated. For a second, I almost pitied him. Almost. "I made a mistake," he murmured, his voice breaking. "It just happened." That sentence lit something cold inside me. "People don't just happen into lies, Thomas. They build them," I said, each word sharp and deliberate. He looked up, eyes glossy, searching for a trace of the woman who used to forgive him. But she wasn't there anymore. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I stood in front of him, holding the paper like a verdict. The man who had shared my bed, my dreams, my life, was now a stranger who had rewritten our story behind my back. My chest ached, not from heartbreak, but from humiliation. The kind that seeps into your bones. He started to speak again, but I held up my hand. "Don't. Every word you say now will make it worse." He nodded slowly, guilt dripping from every movement. The clock on the wall ticked louder, measuring the space between who we were and who we'd just become. I turned away, afraid that if I looked at him too long, I'd either collapse or scream. "I need air," I said, walking toward the door. Behind me, I heard him whisper my name. Small, desperate, meaningless. I didn't answer. That was the moment I knew. Whatever love had once lived in this house had just taken its last breath. The next few days passed in a strange kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind that fills every corner of a home after the truth detonates. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, avoiding his presence, his voice, his attempts at small talk. At night, I slept in the guest room, my back to the door, listening to the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Guilt has its own rhythm, and his was loud enough to wake the dead. But I needed more than silence. I needed truth. The full, unfiltered version he'd never have the courage to give me. So one afternoon, I decided to go straight to the source. Michael, the so-called old friend. My hands trembled as I drove across town, rehearsing what I'd say if he denied everything. Part of me wanted him to lie, just to keep a shred of hope alive. But deep down, I knew this was the day I'd bury whatever illusion was left of my marriage. When he opened the door, his face said everything before he even spoke. Shock, guilt, fear. "Grace," he said, forcing a weak smile. "What are you doing here?" His eyes darted behind me, like he was checking if Thomas was with me. "You know exactly why I'm here," I said, my voice lower than I expected, controlled but sharp. The kind of tone a woman develops when her heart's been broken too many times to count. Michael's hand tightened around the doorknob, his knuckles pale. "Grace, look. I didn't want to be part of this," he said, his eyes darting to the floor. His voice was soaked in shame, the kind that comes from a lie that's lived too long. "Part of what exactly?" I asked, stepping closer. My pulse thundered, but my words came out steady, surgical. He sighed, defeated, and leaned against the doorway like the truth itself was too heavy to carry. "Thomas begged me to say Lucas was mine. He said you'd never forgive him if you found out." There it was, confirmation, the final nail in the coffin. My stomach twisted, but strangely, no tears came. I'd already cried all the tears he deserved. Michael's voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm sorry." I believed him, but it didn't matter. Sorry doesn't unwrite betrayal. It doesn't patch the places where trust used to live. "You know what's funny?" I said quietly. "I thought if I ever got betrayed, I'd scream, break something, lose control. But all I feel right now is pity. For both of you." He nodded, his eyes glistening, and for a moment, I almost saw the man Thomas used to be reflected in him. Charming, broken, selfish. Maybe they were mirrors of each other, both hiding behind half-truths and regret. "Grace," he said softly, "he really did love you." I let out a hollow laugh. Then he should have protected me from his kind of love. I turned away before he could answer, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing like a full stop at the end of a long, painful chapter. Driving home, the city blurred into streaks of light and shadow, like my life replaying through a fogged window. Every street corner seemed to whisper fragments of our past. The cafe where he once held my hand, the bookstore where he said he couldn't imagine life without me. It all felt like a cruel joke now. Love, I realized, isn't supposed to feel like a secret you have to keep from yourself. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, not out of anger, but clarity. Sometimes the end isn't loud. It's just quiet acceptance. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller, like it too had shrunk under the weight of his lies. I didn't go inside right away. I just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the engine, letting the truth settle into the deepest part of me. The woman who had walked out of Michael's house wasn't the same one who'd entered. Something in me had shifted, a thread had snapped, and in its place was resolve. He had taken my trust, but he wasn't taking my strength. That night I watched him sleep from the doorway, his face peaceful, as if he hadn't shattered mine. I wondered if guilt ever kept him awake. Probably not. Men like Thomas sleep well. They mistake silence for forgiveness. I turned off the light and whispered to myself, tomorrow. Not a threat, a promise. Revenge, I'd learned, doesn't always wear rage. Sometimes it wears grace, and waits for the perfect moment to speak. The next evening, I set the table as if nothing had changed. Candles, silverware, the good wine he liked to save for special occasions. Every movement was deliberate, calm, rehearsed. I wasn't cooking for love anymore. I was setting the stage for truth. The smell of roasted herbs filled the kitchen, warm and deceptive, masking the chill that lived beneath my skin. By the time Thomas walked through the door, I'd already practiced my smile in the mirror, soft enough to seem familiar, sharp enough to cut. He hesitated when he saw me, like he wasn't sure if it was safe to breathe. "You cooked," he said quietly, setting his jacket down. His voice carried that hopeful tremor of a man desperate to believe in second chances. I motioned for him to sit. "We need to talk," I said, calm but firm. He obeyed, like he always did when he sensed something deeper than anger, the kind of quiet that meant judgment had already been passed. I poured him a glass of wine, watching the liquid swirl like dark silk. Then I slid the folder across the table, a neat collection of his sins, the DNA results, bank transfers, and at the very top, a draft of our divorce papers. His eyes widened, darting from one document to another. "Grace," he started, but I raised a hand to stop him. "I know," I said simply. "I know everything." The words landed between us like a verdict. He stared at the papers as if they were written in a language he couldn't understand. "You've been watching me," he muttered, voice trembling between guilt and disbelief. "No," I replied, my tone cool and measured. "I've been seeing you. Finally, for who you really are." He reached for the wineglass, but his hand shook too much to lift it. The man who once stood so confidently at board meetings now looked like a boy caught cheating on a test he swore he'd studied for. And for once, I didn't feel small. I felt powerful. "You built another life while destroying mine," I said, my words precise and steady, like glass shards arranged neatly in a pattern. He leaned forward, his face collapsing into regret. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered. That was the moment something inside me cracked open, not with pain, but clarity. People don't mean to cheat, Thomas. They choose to. His eyes filled with tears, but I didn't look away. I wanted him to feel every ounce of what I'd carried in silence. He tried to reach for me again, like touch could rewrite what truth had already etched in stone. "Grace, please." "I love you," he pleaded. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound slicing through his words. "Love?" I said softly. "Love doesn't hide behind lies. It doesn't send money to another woman while telling me you're working late." The room felt colder, the candlelight flickering against the sheen of unshed tears. He had nothing left to say, and I had everything left to reclaim. I slid the divorce papers closer, the pen resting neatly on top, the quietest declaration of war I'd ever made. "You'll sign these tomorrow," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. You can keep your secret family. I'll keep my dignity." His lips parted, as if he might beg, but no words came. Guilt had swallowed whatever pride he had left. I gathered my things from the table, not in anger, but in peace. It was the first time in years I'd felt in control. As I walked toward the door, I could feel his eyes on me, searching for a woman who no longer existed. Behind me, he whispered, "Grace, please don't do this." I stopped just long enough to look back, meeting his gaze one final time. "You already did," I said quietly. The truth in those words seemed to hollow him out. I turned away, my heels clicking against the tile, a sound that felt like punctuation to the life I was leaving behind. When I reached the doorway, I paused, taking in the sight of him hunched over the table, the same table where our mornings had once begun with laughter. Now it was littered with proof of his lies. The irony wasn't lost on me. Love had built this home, but betrayal had remodeled it completely. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was freedom beginning to take shape. A week later, the morning arrived with an unfamiliar stillness. No more waiting for his footsteps, no more glancing at my phone for messages that never came. Freedom, I realized, didn't roar. It whispered. It began in the quiet moments when I no longer felt the urge to explain myself. I sat at my kitchen table, my table now, sipping coffee and staring at the documents spread before me. Every piece of proof, every lie, every transaction. They weren't just remnants of betrayal anymore. They were tools. That's when the idea came to me, calm, calculated, almost poetic. If he had built his world on deceit, then the truth would be the very thing to bring it down. I drafted an anonymous email to his company's ethics board, attaching every document he'd hidden from me. The subject line was simple: "For your review." I didn't need to say more. I hit send, then sat back, watching the screen go blank. There was no satisfaction in revenge, just balance, restored at last. By the end of the week, the whispers had begun. Calls he didn't return, meetings canceled. His confidence, that smug armor he wore so proudly, started to crack. When I heard he'd been suspended, I didn't smile. I just exhaled. Justice doesn't always come in courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through the click of a mouse and the sound of a liar's empire beginning to crumble. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, the same vintage he used to save for celebrations. Funny how it tasted sweeter now, without the aftertaste of deceit. My phone buzzed once, twice, then again. His name flashed on the screen, each call more desperate than the last. I didn't answer. Instead, I recorded a voicemail, my voice calm and steady, the kind of tone you use when you've already said goodbye in your heart. "You built your empire on deceit, Thomas," I said. "It's only fair it collapses the same way." I pressed send and watched the little icon spin, sealing his fate with a quiet kind of finality. I didn't rage, I didn't cry. I just sat there, letting the silence reclaim the space he'd once filled with half-truths and charm. Later, I changed the locks, changed my number, and folded away the last photograph of us, the one where we both smiled like people who still believed in forever. I slipped it into a drawer I no longer planned to open. That was the burial, not of him, but of us. Outside, the city lights flickered against the window, each one a tiny reminder that the world keeps spinning, even when yours stops. I realized then that revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about reclaiming the parts of yourself you'd handed over piece by piece to someone who never deserved them. I wasn't punishing him anymore. I was freeing myself. And in that freedom, there was power, the kind he'd never understand. The following morning, I watched the sunrise for the first time in what felt like years. No guilt, no pretending, just me, alive, unbroken, and finally in charge of my own story. My phone lay silent, but I knew the chaos that would follow for him. The investigation, the suspension, the whispered pity from colleagues he used to impress. I didn't need front-row seats to his downfall. I'd already seen enough. What mattered was that he'd finally have to live in the truth he'd spent years running from. Later, I packed the last of his things into a single box, not out of hate, but out of closure. Each shirt, each letter, each trace of him was a chapter I no longer needed to reread. I left the box on the porch, like a relic from a past life. Standing there, I felt something shift. Vengeance had done its part. Now came the peace that follows the storm. For the first time, I didn't feel like the betrayed one. I felt like the survivor, the author, the woman who'd rewritten the ending. That night, before heading to bed, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she finally looked whole. The ache in my chest had softened into something lighter, almost hopeful. I whispered to my reflection, "You did it. You let go." It wasn't victory I saw in my eyes. It was liberation, the kind of freedom no apology could ever buy. Months later, the scent of roasted coffee and the soft chatter of a cafe replaced the silence that used to echo through my mornings. I'd built a new rhythm, one that didn't depend on anyone's approval. My laptop sat open beside a half-finished sketchbook, paint smudges on my fingers. I'd started volunteering for a nonprofit that helped single mothers rebuild their lives. Maybe that was my way of transforming pain into purpose. Funny how life has a way of planting flowers where everything once burned. Nina slid into the chair across from me, her smile warm, knowing. "You look different," she said, stirring her tea. "Lighter." I laughed softly. "That's because I finally put down the weight that wasn't mine to carry." She tilted her head. "Do you ever think about him? I paused, not because the question hurt, but because it didn't. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I remember, lies rot everything they touch. I'm just glad I stopped breathing the same air. We sat there for a while, sunlight spilling through the window, bathing the cafe in gold. Outside, a little boy ran past, his laughter cutting through the air like music. I watched him with his mother, her hand steady on his back, her eyes full of love. And for the first time, I felt no sting of comparison, only peace. I smiled, realizing I'd finally stepped out of the story he wrote for me and into the one I'd written for myself. After Nina left, I lingered for a while, tracing circles on my coffee cup, thinking about how different peace feels from happiness. Happiness is loud, fleeting, peace is quiet, rooted. It doesn't demand attention, it just stays. The world outside the window kept moving, cars passing, people laughing, life unfolding, and I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't watching from the sidelines. I was part of it again, present, breathing, whole. I opened my laptop and began typing the outline for a new project, a series of workshops to help women rediscover themselves after betrayal. Not as victims, but as survivors who rebuild from the ashes with grace and grit. The cursor blinked on the screen, almost like a heartbeat. Every word I wrote was a piece of me reclaiming itself. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about redemption. Mine. As I packed my things, I caught my reflection in the cafe's window. Sunlight on my hair, a calm smile I hadn't seen in years. There was no trace of the woman who had once begged for truth. She was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, beautifully scarred. Walking out into the warm afternoon, I whispered to myself, "He gave another woman a child, but I gave myself a new life, one he'll never be part of." And for the first time, that truth felt like freedom.